The small town of Greyhaven was shrouded in a dense fog that night, as if the world itself wanted to hide what was about to happen. Surrounded by dense pine forests and isolated by steep mountains, Greyhaven seemed like the perfect place to disappear from the map, and perhaps from reality itself. It was a place where time seemed to have stopped, with Victorian houses in faded shades of gray and blue, silent streets, and flickering streetlights that carried a sinister secret. That night, as the rain softly tapped against the windows of the Rosewood Inn, a small decrepit hotel in the heart of town, for strangers gathered without knowing their lives were about to intertwine irreversibly. Each of them carried their own baggage of secrets and regrets. Emily, a writer in search of inspiration for her next novel. Peter, a former police officer who had lost everything in an unresolved case. Claire, a young scientist specializing in unexplained phenomena. And John, a middle-aged truck driver who seemed to always be running from something. "What brought you to Greyhaven?" asked Mrs. Holloway, the hotel proprietor, as she served steaming cups of tea. Her tone was kind, but her eyes carried a curious, almost suspicious glint. Before any of them could answer, thunder roared in the distance, followed by a brief blackout that plunged the lounge into darkness. When the lights returned, something had changed. A heavy, oppressive presence seemed to weigh in the air. "Did you feel that?" Claire asked, adjusting her glasses and looking around. No one immediately replied, but their exchanged glances said it all. Something was wrong. As lightning illuminated the sky, a piercing scream broke the night's silence, coming from the forest surrounding the hotel. Emily was the first to react, standing up from her place by the fireplace. "Someone's in danger," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. Peter placed a hand on her shoulder, trying to calm her. "It could be dangerous. We don't know what's out there." Claire, however, was already grabbing her flashlight and backpack. "We can't just ignore that. Didn't you hear the tone of that scream? It sounded desperate." Reluctantly, the others agreed, and the group headed toward the forest. The forest was too quiet, except for the sound of their steps on the damp ground and the occasional rustling of leaves. The mist seemed denser there, almost alive, moving as if trying to hide them from the outside world. Suddenly, Claire stopped, pointing her flashlight at the ground. "Do you see that?" she asked. The beam revealed strange footprints. They weren't animal nor human, long, thin, and deeply marked into the soil. John swallowed hard. "I've seen plenty of strange things on the road, but this is different." Peter furrowed his brow, trying to remain calm. "It could just be an animal we don't know. Let's keep going." The group followed the tracks, which led them to a clearing. At its center stood something unexpected, an old stone well, surrounded by lit candles that appeared to have been placed there recently. The air was heavy, carrying a metallic scent mixed with something sweet that none of them could identify. Emily took a step forward, but Claire grabbed her arm. "Don't touch anything," Claire warned. This could be, before she could finish, the sound of footsteps echoed through the forest, and everyone turned at once. Something, or someone, was watching them. The sound of footsteps in the forest seemed to grow closer, yet it echoed from every direction. Emily clutched her coat tightly around herself, trying to suppress the shiver that came as much from fear as from the cold. "Is someone there?" Peter shouted, his firm voice cutting through the silence. No answer came, only the faint echo of his words. Claire shone her flashlight into the surrounding trees, searching for movement. "Whatever it is, it's circling us," she murmured, more to herself than to the others. Suddenly, one of the candles around the well went out, followed by another and another, until the clearing was nearly swallowed by darkness. "This isn't normal," John whispered, gripping a piece of wood from the ground as an improvised weapon. Before anyone could respond, a low guttural sound echoed from the direction of the well. It was as if something inside it was shifting, scratching at the ancient stone walls. Emily took a step back, nearly stumbling. "Is that coming from the well?" Peter approached the well cautiously, his flashlight trembling in his hand. He shone it into the opening, but the darkness seemed to devour the light. "I don't see anything," he said, his voice lacking conviction. Claire was about to suggest they return to the hotel when something leapt from the well's edge. It was too fast to be identified clearly, but large enough to knock Peter to the ground. He cried out, struggling against the shadowy figure, as the others stood frozen in terror. The creature, whatever it was, disappeared into the forest before anyone could react. "Peter, are you okay?" Claire rushed to him, helping him to his feet. "I'm fine, but that wasn't human," Peter replied, his voice shaky. His eyes were wide with fear he couldn't suppress. Claire grabbed the fallen flashlight and examined Peter's arm, which now bore deep gashes, as if claws had torn into his skin. "We need to get out of here," John said firmly. "Now." As the group began retreating toward the hotel, the forest seemed to follow them. A constant rustling sound trailed their movements, growing louder with every step. Claire felt something wet and cold drip onto her shoulder. Looking up, she expected to see a branch or leaves, but what she saw made her scream. Above them, something hung in the trees, a body grotesquely twisted and stretched as though by some inhuman force. Black, tar-like liquid dripped from it, pooling on the forest floor. The others turned their flashlights upward, their faces frozen in shock and disbelief. "Run!" John shouted, grabbing Emily by the arm. The group fled back along the path they had come, the sound of snapping branches and heavy footsteps following close behind. Every time they glanced back, shadows seemed to move between the trees, never close enough to be seen clearly, but always present. When they finally reached the hotel, relief was short-lived. The windows were completely dark, and the front door, which had been ajar when they left, was now tightly shut. Peter pulled at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "This doesn't make sense," Peter said, breathless. "It was open when we left." Claire pulled a multi-tool from her pocket and began working on the lock. As she fiddled with it, the forest noises grew louder, as if the shadows were drawing closer. Emily pounded on the door.
"Mrs. Holloway, open up! We're being chased!"
But the only response was the same low guttural sound they had heard before, this time, coming from inside the hotel. Claire finally managed to unlock the door and pushed it open. The group rushed inside, slamming the door shut behind them. The sound of the lock clicking into place was a brief relief, but the silence that followed was even more terrifying. Inside the hotel, everything looked different. Furniture was covered in white sheets, and the air smelled strongly of mold. It was as if the place had been abandoned for decades. "This can't be happening," Emily murmured, looking around. "We were just here less than an hour ago." Peter shone his flashlight around the room. The windows were covered in a thick layer of dust, blocking any view of the outside world. "It's like the place aged overnight," he said, his voice low. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed from the upper floor, freezing everyone in place. John grabbed a piece of wood lying nearby and stepped forward. "Stay here. I'll check it out." Before anyone could stop him, he began climbing the creaking staircase. The rest of the group remained in the lobby, straining to hear John's movements. The footsteps grew faint, then stopped altogether. A sudden, piercing scream shattered the silence, followed by abrupt silence once again. Claire rushed to the base of the stairs, but hesitated. "John, are you okay?" she called out. There was no response, only the faint sound of wind through a cracked window. Peter took the lead, climbing the stairs with Claire and Emily close behind. At the top, they found the piece of wood John had carried, lying on the floor. There was no sign of him, only strange, deep scratches on the walls, forming incomprehensible patterns. The group cautiously entered the room. At its center stood an old, cracked mirror covered by a dusty sheet. Claire pulled the sheet off, revealing the fractured surface. But the mirror reflected something that wasn't in the room, a figure standing motionless behind them. Emily spun around, but the room was empty. "We're being watched," Claire said, her voice barely audible. Before they could react, the mirror began to tremble, cracks spreading rapidly across its surface. A high-pitched sound filled the air, and the figure in the reflection moved, extending a shadowy hand toward them through the glass. Peter grabbed a chair and hurled it at the mirror. The glass shattered, and the noise ceased instantly. The room fell silent, but something had changed. The shards on the floor reflected not just the three of them, but multiple shadowy figures surrounding them. "Run!" Claire shouted, and the group fled downstairs toward the entrance. They flung the door open, but instead of the forest, they were met with an infinite black void. The emptiness seemed to pulse, drawing them in. The sound of guttural growls returned, this time echoing from every direction. The hotel itself began to feel alive, the walls pulsating as if made of flesh. Emily clung to Peter's arm, tears streaming down her face. "This is never going to end, is it?" "We have to find another way out," Peter said, his voice firm despite the terror in his eyes. Suddenly, a faint light appeared through the front door. It flickered like a beacon in the darkness, but its origin was unclear. With no other option, the group stepped cautiously into the light. They found themselves back at the clearing. The candles around the well were lit again, and the glowing red symbols had returned, brighter than before. But this time, the well emitted a low resonating hum, as if it were alive. Claire stepped forward, examining the symbols more closely. "This is the source," she said. "The well isn't just keeping something in, it's feeding on us. What do we do?" Emily asked, her voice shaking. Claire opened the book she still carried. The pages displayed a ritual, the instructions clear and horrifying. "We can seal it," she said, "but it requires a sacrifice." Peter and Emily exchanged a horrified look. "No," Emily said, shaking her head. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," Claire replied firmly. "This thing will keep coming until it consumes us all. One of us has to stay." Claire moved into the circle of glowing symbols. She placed the book on the ground and began reciting the words written within. The symbols responded to her voice, glowing brighter with every phrase, pulsing like a heartbeat. The well began to tremble, and the low hum turned into a deafening roar. The creature emerged once more, its shadowy tendrils stretching upward like smoke, and its glowing eyes fixed on the group. Peter grabbed a branch from the ground and shouted, "Hey, over here." He waved the branch, trying to draw the creature's attention away from Claire. Emily picked up a rock and hurled it at the creature, her fear overridden by desperation. The rock passed through its nebulous form but seemed to anger it. The creature shifted toward them, tendrils lashing out. The ground beneath them began to crack, and the air grew heavy with an unearthly pressure. Claire's voice reached a crescendo, and the symbols flared one last time before exploding in a blinding flash. The creature was pulled back into the well, its form disintegrating into wisps of smoke. The clearing fell silent, save for Claire's labored breathing. Peter staggered to his feet and looked toward the circle. Claire remained inside, but the symbols now glowed faintly, like embers. She turned to face them, tears streaming down her face. "It's done," she said, "but I can't leave." Emily rushed forward, stopping just short of the circle. "No, there has to be another way. You can't stay here." Her voice broke as tears spilled down her cheeks. Claire shook her head. "The ritual requires a seal. The well won't hold without someone to bind it. If I leave, it will escape again." She offered a small, sad smile. "You have to go. The forest will let you leave now." Peter placed a hand on Emily's shoulder, his own eyes wet with emotion. "We have to honor her decision. She saved us." As they began walking back toward the hotel, the forest seemed to transform. The mist cleared, and the oppressive darkness lifted. By the time they reached the Rosewood Inn, it looked different, cleaner, brighter, as though the events of the night had never happened. Mrs. Holloway was waiting for them at the entrance. "You made it back," she said, smiling warmly. "Not many do." Emily looked at Peter, her eyes still brimming with tears. "And Claire? What happens to her?" Mrs. Holloway's smile faded, replaced by a solemn expression. "She'll be remembered. But now it's time for you to go. The road is open." Without another word, Peter and Emily left the inn. As they walked, the first rays of sunlight pierced through the trees. The oppressive weight that had clung to them all night seemed to dissipate with the dawn. When they reached the main road, Emily turned back for one last look at the inn. The building stood silent, shrouded once more in mist, as though it had never been touched by the events of the night. Peter placed a hand on her shoulder. "Let's go," he said. "It's over." Emily nodded, though the sadness in her eyes remained. Together, they walked away, leaving the mysteries of Greyhaven behind. As they disappeared into the distance, the road ahead seemed endless, shrouded in mist that gently faded as the sunlight grew stronger. The mysteries of the Rosewood Inn and the ancient well remained behind, lost once again in the shadows of the forest.